philosopher's love letter. So this is another one of those interlude segue kind of tracks. And it's essentially a poem, right? Um, this one, I think, lyrically speaking, as a poem, is more in tune with, I guess, how my mind operates. You know, like my friend Coventry has told me many times over the years that I have a very, I forget how she worded it exactly, but different kind of thought process, mind, um, that I think she put it in terms of that my brain is very complicated, and so a lot of what I talk about in this song is waxing poetic and trying to go into more abstract sort of metaphors and allegories, because that's just kind of how I think a lot of times. But before I go into that, I'll talk about the music for this song. So, as I've mentioned plenty of times already, you know, while I was essentially writing the lyrics to the entire album, which, was the first thing that I did and completed, I was jamming on my guitar some couple of days a week sort of thing, and just coming up with guitar riffs, as demos. Um, and I pretty much used every single one of them. And then some, as I started actually getting into the recording process. I'd be jamming one morning and, okay, let me go on and record this riff, and just kind of move on from there, instead of just doing a demo on my iPhone. But anyway, there was one riff that I would listen to and just kind of come to this conclusion of, I don't like it. And so what happened was, I was jamming one morning and came up with this pretty simple, kind of funky, rhythmic, up tempo um, riff that initially I thought was like, oh, this could be fun. I could do something with this. And then, months later, when was starting to do the actual recordings for the album, I'd play it back and be like, this is pretty vanilla. Like, it just sounds too much like other stuff that I've already recorded or written, and there's not a lot of variation to it. It's just boring. And so I figured I would never use it. So then one morning, I was like after work in my den recording guitar parts for another song completely. I don't even remember which one that I was working on, but it was, one of the earlier songs in the recording process. And I finished up with what I was working on that day, got to a, solid checkpoint. And I was like, I'm not going to work on this song anymore. Um, I still have time on that I can spend, before I need to settle down for the day. I've got, I worked on this other song and figured that it was going to take longer than it actually did. So I was like, well, I could either, just like pack up and, spend the rest of the day watching TV or something. Or I could, try to do something, even though like I didn't have anything else that I wanted to work on in that moment. So I was just like, well, I'll just jam. I'm already plugged up. I'm already got the headphones in. I'll just start jamming. And I when it comes to like my guitar setup, I'm kind of evenly distributed between like stomp boxes and then like a effects processor, like a digital effects processor, even though it's super old and antiquated. I got it for cheap years ago and it still gets the job done in my opinion. So why fix something that ain't broke, you know what I mean? um, so I was just jamming around on my processor, cycling through different effects, and I had this effect that I designed probably a decade or more ago, um, that I think I named the effect M83, which M83 is, this pretty decently well known French electronica kind of band. Um, and like, I'm not like huge into electronica or anything like that, but their album, oh, I think it was their second or third album. I, I can't remember the name of the album. I can see the cover in my head, but I can't think of it. Anyway, there's a song on it called Teen Angst, however you want to pronounce that. That like my fourth year in college, like my roommate at the time and I would like play that song over and over again. It was just like the most ambient, chill song like we had ever heard up to that point. Like, still to this day, that song just freaking blows me away. Like, how far ahead of its time it was. Um, but like, I designed this guitar effect kind of based off of this like high pitched droney. I don't know if it's a guitar line that they were playing or if it was synth or whatever, but I wanted to get like a similar sound based on that song because I just thought it was cool. And I've had that effect pretty much that way on my processor, for a decade or whatever. So I think I switched to that and was just messing around with something. It just sort of hit me like I could do something with this. Like, this would be super chill, super ambient, super just clean sounding, and I could really have some fun with this. And then it sort of like hit me all at once. Wait a second, that really kind of gunky vanilla just guitar riff that I wrote down that I figured I'll never use it. Maybe I can use it after all, but with this, instead of doing something that's, kind of funky and rhythmic, what if I change it up completely, use the same chord progression, which is, very easy chord progression, but make it ambient with this M83 style effect. And that is exactly how the music for this song came about. Um, Literally, I recorded like all the guitars and bass in an hour and a half. It was like the quickest that I worked on anything on this entire album. Like it just came together like that. Um, so like I stacked, different guitar parts, did different things, um, different effects. Just record, the M83 effect kind of in the background. I think in post production, I threw some extra reverb, um, like a reverb plug-in on top of it to make it even more ambient than it already was. But yeah, like it was one of those things that, like, in the spur of the moment, like there were no rules. I figured I could do whatever I wanted to, and so I was like, oh, I'm gonna do like these crazy tremolo effects with reverb, and I'm gonna like hard pan it to the left using an ebow to get these like super high guitar tones. And that's what I did. Like all of it was kind of on the spur of the moment, just like that. And so like musically, this song still just, or segue, interlude, whatever you want to call it, just amazes me. Um, because I don't know what it would have sounded like if I hadn't just continued working that morning, but like it wouldn't be nearly as cool, I don't think. Um, who knows what it would have been if I just put it off for another day, but it was one of those mornings where I was like, yeah, I really like broke through like a wall or something. Like it was pretty amazing. Um, and got to give a shout out to my buddy Joe Lombardi because months later I was over at his house one night for like a birthday party sort of deal for one of my other buddies, and like I was in a music mode sort of mood that night and grabbed my laptop and played this track back for him, and he sat there and listened to it, and at the end he was like, dude, this one section right here, automate the bass and just make it like really raise up. And that was something that I'd never like considered with this song. And so I was like, well, let give me a couple of minutes. And um, I did exactly kind of what he asked without like automation, just kind of doubled the track and had it um, set the volume levels for it kind of on the fly and had it sort of fade in. And when I listened back to it, like with him in that moment, like it just gave me chills. I was like, dude, this right here is, yeah. Like, and so like got to give him credit. That was like his idea, and it just worked in like ways that I could have never, you know, foresaw. Um, so going into the lyrics now, and what's going on in this story. So the protagonist has, been in prison and beaten and all that stuff, but he's at the point now where he realizes that he's probably going to die, that he's going to be executed. Um, and like when I was thinking about it early on in the writing process, I was thinking that like he got, like I sort of had this imagery that he got his hands on like scraps of paper or a journal or something and a pencil, and he was just writing his thoughts down, um, while in the darkness of his jail cell. That's originally how I pictured it, and that, he's looking outside a window or something, knowing that like the next day or in a couple of hours he was going to be taken by the guards or police or soldiers, who, the people that have him, and he was going to be executed outdoors, like gallows style, or firing squad, like whatever. But in, I guess, the last year or so, and in producing the artwork for uh, this particular song, which, um, fun fact, the art for this song, there's something I learned in college, is like a water media technique. You can use coffee as 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 a medium, and so that's what I did. That entire piece of art is done in coffee. And it's not like you get a cup of coffee and just like pour it on the canvas or the paper or whatever and just use a paintbrush. No, it's a little more involved than that. But yeah, I used coffee for it to kind of give it this like old, like sepia tone sort of photograph feel to it. But anyway, when I produced that artwork, basically I produced it like last summer slash fall. Um, the image had changed from him being in a jail cell to like they're aiming at him, the soldiers. It's a firing squad, and he's just standing there like writing his last will and testament, basically in like a journal, with like staring down the guns, and he's just kind of resolved like, well, this is the end, might as well write this down and hopefully somebody will read it someday. And so that was, yeah, that was the image that I wanted to portray in this particular poem. And he starts out by asking, will you remove this cup? Just same way Jesus did. Um, I want to be like your son, yet how can a finite man, how when lost the only known and victory is eclipsed by defeat? Um, and so, like, from there, he's talking about it's the correlation between possibility versus inevitability. And, you know, that was kind of personal to me, because some of that, you know, one of the like, it wasn't an argument per se, but it was like a debate that my mentor and I would get into every once in a while when we were like really starting to befriend each other. Because like she and I had known each other for 2 years before like we actually kind of became friends. And she was the kind of person who saw possibility in that anything was possible. And I was like, I can't deny possibility, but I'm more interested in probability and what is inevitable to happen. And so, like, even writing that was me kind of recognizing that debate with her. Um, because I say, and this is my mind, the way it works, as probability would seem to negate all chances of flourishing love when mankind rumors of wars and searches for new gods to wed. Um, and then I say, like, Jesus, your bride is inevitable. So, I mean, that isn't just like possibility to me. It's, if I'm to take Christianity seriously, then the will of God for his bride and his church is just inevitable. Um, but something that was on my head, I guess, like theologically at the time, is that, and this gets into romantic theology, I suppose, is, the marriage metaphor throughout the Bible um, is used as a metaphor to describe mankind's relationship with God and what he desires, with communion with mankind. Um, but it's recognizing too that we fail at that, and that, like, it's kind of a back and forth sort of thing, that the marriage metaphor and just marriage in general is supposed to point towards that heavenly relationship. But because we live in a world of broken relationships, like, it just skews a lot of how we perceive and view God. Um, and so, some of that was just kind of dealing with, like, I'm talking about, like, in the poem here, of trying to reconcile the two. And, it is hard to do. It's almost impossible, but yeah, it's just dealing with, broken relationships in general. And him asking himself rhetorically, should he come to an altar with, expectancy, um, for what is to come, for that inevitability, for the bride, and stuff like that, of recognizing that the marriage metaphor, but in marriage here on earth, is, mankind, a man goes to the altar basically to die to himself, um, to meet, a bride who's going to come to him and die to herself. And that, like, together they sort of resurrect as a new creature, as becoming one. And so, I mean, even that, um, and a lot of this goes back to, like, reading, an old Rob Bell book, years ago, called Sex God, which, I picked up from, like, a secondhand bookstore, because I was like, ooh, that's good marketing. That's, an excellent title. And then, like, going into it and realizing that it's not about, like, juicy sex theology or whatever, but it's actually getting into, like, marriage metaphors and such. And, it was, for what it is, like, a pretty eye-opening book. And, it has been an influence on me, um, because I think he gets into some really interesting ideas of, romantic theology, and how it isn't just, a metaphor for people on earth or whatever, but it's supposed to give an image of what heaven and our relationship with God is supposed to be about. Um, and so, even with that, it's like I go from thinking about these things into, like, ideas of, like, metaphysics, and, um, you know time appearing to be like a one-dimensional pinpoint to the Almighty, from his, like, perspective, and being infinite. um, And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just rhetorical questions of like asking, you know, how inevitable is some sort of utopic heavenly state? Can it ever be seen on earth? Um, you know, what is it about God that has this everlasting patience for humanity and for a church and bride that seems to just be racing towards its own demise? Um, and so, like at the end of asking these questions, he wishes that God would remove the cup of suffering and his own mortality, his impending mortality, really, because he's facing off the firing line. He wishes God would just take it away, but he realizes that that death must be the cost, for his faith, that that he has to stare it down, and that he realizes, and I use the word metaxis, which I only learned that word from a Silent Planet song from one of their older albums, because I was like, that's an interesting word. What does it mean? And realizing that it's like the tug of war, or the middle ground between two opposing concepts. So, like, being stuck in between love and hate, or war and peace, or whatever. It's like this old Greek or Platonic word for this kind of like being stuck between dualisms, essentially. um and he feels that tug, that he's stuck, you know as we like to say, between a rock and a hard place. um but despite his writing, down his like final words, he also realizes at the very end that he's ready to finally like speak. And I think the personal meaning for that final line or whatever was that there came a time back, in those days when I was writing this, where it was staying quiet and not saying a whole lot and not offering my opinion all the time, but like, yeah, just staying quiet and kind of to myself, and then realizing that like the time had come for me to like stand up and say what it was that I needed to say. And so, I mean, maybe that's kind of meta in itself, of like me like writing these lyrics and this music and all. It was even like a self-reflection of recognizing that it was time for me to like stand up and actually say what it is that I needed to say, because you know like I think I said at the very chapter 0 or whatever, um, of this series of videos, that I recognize that the kind of story and the kind of emotional appeal or whatever that I was looking for, the kind of story that I wanted to hear, wasn't being told in a lot of the music that I love and enjoy. And the recognition in that process that maybe I'm not finding it from other people because that isn't their story to tell. Maybe this is the story that I have to tell. Maybe it's the words that's coming from in here, and that I can't expect somebody else to create art that I want to say, because they're not me. And don't want to be solipsistic or egotistical in saying that. It's just a, it's just a reality of, sometimes we expect other people to create the kind of work that only we can create because it's the words that we've been given, and it's the ideas and the concepts that are up here and in here. And so, yeah, that's why it's kind of meta, is that I was recognizing that I had to tell this story, And so back into like the literal meaning of what's going on in this world and in this story is that he realizes that he isn't just writing this like philosophical love letter to, Aurora, or to the soldiers, or to whoever it may be, to God. um, that, yeah, he's writing this down, but it's actually the moment it's all kind of coming to a point and to a pinnacle, that it's actually time for him to like close this journal or whatever, and to look up, face these guns, and actually open his mouth and actually verbalize what it is that he really actually wants to say. And so that that's what happens in this song, is that he reaches that moment and that point, facing death, facing certain death, and realizing that this these words actually aren't the last words that he has to say. And that is where the next three songs come into play.